All right, thank you. So in this session, we're going to talk about blended learning from a different focus, basically. So trying to give you some different perspective on how you could develop, an online course, considering the situation right now where all the summer courses are going to be offered fully online, and maybe the fall semester. So trying to find a way to be more agile in the kind of things that you can do online. And so this session is just giving you some strategies and things to think about, in the next couple of days, basically. So before we get started, we're just always interested in the kind of things you have in mind. So what is one thing you'd like to leave with today? So I'm just going to give you a minute, and if you could think about something and maybe share your answers in the chat, that would be wonderful. As Lucas mentioned, the chat is going to get quickly busy, so feel free to put some notes, and we won't be using the microphone in that case. So please share your response in the chat. All right, I can see a lot of things going on, so thank you so much for sharing. It'll be hard for me to summarize, but a lot of you are interested in strategies on how to engage students. Some of you teach language courses, so I expect this is a fairly important aspect of your teaching. I can see some of you are interested in some of the ways to break out people into groups, so we may not be talking about technical aspect, like really about teaching strategies in that particular session, but we'll keep a note on your feedback and just get back to you if we need to provide additional details to you. So student engagement is really an important piece, and definitely in this session we'll discuss ways of making that happen in the online environment, basically. So we have 3 subjects for today. So we're hoping by the end of this session you're going to be able to make an informed decision about an online blended learning format for your course, identify elements of your course that will be facilitated in real time and developed online. So that's really the main aspect of blend, is just having those 2 modalities speak to one another, and thoughtfully integrate both aspects, even online, in a blended learning format to support student engagement and active learning. So that's the kind of things that we will be spending a lot of time on today in the next hour. Just a quick definition, but before getting started on blended learning. So the traditional definition of blended learning is the use of traditional classroom teaching methods together with the use of online learning for the same students studying the same content in the same course. It is a thoughtful fusion of face-to-face and online learning experiences. So I really like this definition because it's a nice and simple way of trying to understand, okay, it's really the fusion of two different things. And in that case, again, we offer you a different perspective where everything will be developed online, and then it's interesting considerations about the kind of things that, okay, what are the things I can do in a synchronous manner and asynchronous manner? And that's the reason why we have this particular slide right there, blended learning through a different lens. So in that case, instead of considering the kind of things that you could merge between what you do in the class and online, it's just really thinking, okay, I'm fully online right now, and what are the things that I can do? So we're going to be discussing about the things that you could do in a synchronous manner, basically in real time, what works best in your particular environment, and also consider the things that maybe students could do on their own in the asynchronous manner, meaning it's not happening at the same time. It's students having a little bit more flexibility and studying on their own pace. So trying to really balance those 2 environments and just see what makes sense for your particular teaching context. So we're going to be using different strategies, having some brainstorm activities, and discussing what the options you have in mind already. And again, if you always have questions, you can choose to ask your questions in the chat, and we'll make sure to address some of those during this session. And I'm going to leave it to Lucas now.
So again, as Manuel said, a lot of the focus today is going to be thinking about the when of using synchronous versus asynchronous teaching. And I just want to start just by mentioning, and I'm sure everyone in the room knows this, but synchronous teaching refers to teaching in real time so that we're doing something simultaneously. And asynchronous refers to teaching not in real time. So we're doing things at different times. And we're going to talk about some of the affordances of each of those. So I just wanted to start with this image. And could I get a thumbs up in the chat if you've seen this image before? Just curious whether folks have seen this image before. Okay, great. Charisse has. So this is an image from Daniel Stafford, and he is in faculty development, and he's talking about the idea of immediacy, which is going to be fairly similar to our use of synchronous in this case. And he's also talking about use of bandwidth. So how much bandwidth our computers are using, how much bandwidth we're asking students to use. So I think at the beginning of this, for many of us, we were focused a lot in the high bandwidth, high immediacy column. What that means is immediacy being, you know, the ability to talk to someone right away, to get the answers right away. So we were focused a lot on video conferences, audio conferences, and these tools where we used a lot of student bandwidth. We required students to be present at a certain time and space, and it had high immediacy, a sense of teacher presence if done well. Traditional online learning, as Stafford points out, tends to rest a little bit more in the green box in the left-hand corner. So more traditional online learning will have discussion boards with images, email, reading with text images, and this is fairly low immediacy, so it's not responded to right away. There could be asynchronous discussion boards. Students could read something and respond. And in the yellow, we have our pre-recorded video, our asynchronous discussions with video, our pre-recorded audio. So fairly low immediacy, but a higher strain on students' bandwidth. And finally, on the bottom right, we have our collaborative documents. So we may have a high immediacy. The students could be talking with each other. We could be in those documents. We might be group and chat messaging, for example, the chat tool in Canvas, or tools like Mattermost, team chat tools, where we're getting more high immediacy but lower bandwidth. And what Stafford talks about in this article is thinking about those spaces where we can develop teacher presence and we can develop focus in the lower bandwidth areas, as well as thinking about how we integrate all of our areas within our course, but with the idea that there's often an over-reliance on video and audio conferencing for a huge part of the course, and this can be quite challenging for students. So we're going to do a brainstorming activity with you right now, and just thinking about, in your context, what works asynchronously better and what works synchronously better. And to do this, we're just going to use the chat, and we'll get you just to write asynchronous or async and drop in a couple points, sync and drop in a couple points. So, you know, one example might be virtual office hours or mentoring may work synchronously in your course. So most of you have been teaching, most of you have been kind of playing with these modalities. Let's just I'll give you about 3 minutes in the chat just to share what has been working better for you synchronously and asynchronously. So I'll start you off now. Go ahead. And I'll get you to keep going on that. So right now we have, I see teamwork in discussion posts, grammar exercises is asynchronous, review sessions are office hours and synchronous. Some of us are brand new to online teaching, and so these ideas of asynchronous and synchronous may be fairly new. And I'm just going to read a comment from Danny here. I teach music teachers how to teach. So working synchronously is very important. I need to correct as we go in real time. I may need to focus on synchronous ideas about playing rather than playing together. Async, guiding students through questions and workshops. Asynchronously watching a video, reading comprehension questions. So lots of great ideas here. So I'm just looking through the list now. We have asynchronous reading, asynchronous guiding students through the workshop, a little bit from Danny around modeling in the synchronous environment, Q&As in the synchronous environment, and from Sylvia, explanation of content that is difficult. Sylvia, would you be comfortable hopping on the microphone now and just quickly explaining why you use synchronous delivery for difficult content?
Sure. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I generally do some mini lessons asynchronously, but then there's always some, theoretical points, or if we're doing comparison of theory, or if it's even statistics, right? I mean, thinking about what might be difficult, the synchronous time is useful to have students ask questions and to explain on the go, right? So the questions sort of generate from each other that don't always come out in a discussion thread, right? So if somebody asks a question, it sparks another question and we get through some difficult content. So I wouldn't do the basic content that way, but just taking some time to really dig deep in things that are difficult to understand.
Wonderful. Thanks for sharing.
You're welcome.
And I'll get you to mute now. And Anka, do you mind jumping on the line and talking a little bit about why you use synchronous for teamwork?
Yeah, I really want students to have a feeling of community. So at least when they come and meet synchronously, they can speak to each other and build knowledge together.
Wonderful, thanks. And maybe one more, Danny, I was wondering if you could jump on and talk a little bit about teaching in music and why synchronous is so important.
What I'm trying to express here, but I'm not doing a very good job in text, is that it's actually kind of impossible to teach the kind of music I teach online because it requires absolute real time. And there's even a microsecond lag in the technology makes it impossible for me to teach people how to teach kids music in real time. So the synchronous isn't even as synchronous as I need it to be for that. So my struggle is so much of what I do in all my methods classes where I teach this is based on a real-time, face-to-face, correcting as they go, microsecond, thing. So I'm struggling to find ways to do that in a synchronous manner. I can teach, what I was trying to express in the text is that I can teach about music, I can teach about music theory, I can have them do exercises, but for me to be actually teaching them, unless I'm doing it, I do it, then they do it, I do it, then they do it. I'm struggling for finding ways to make this work, so I'm having to completely change my pedagogy to make it work on the online environment.
Okay, thanks for sharing. So things that may not even be able to be taught synchronously.
Well, that's the problem that actually require to be in place, like teaching soccer. right? Like, teaching certain kinds of sports that require us to, in real time, to be there with the practitioners. And
Wonderful.
I'm struggling with that a little bit. There's lots of ways that I can see, and I'm really appreciating all the suggestions that people are making, because certainly all the group work and teamwork, all that stuff can be done. But with music, it's particularly challenging.
Wonderful. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah.
All right. So thanks for sharing some different ways that you're using synchronous. And again, we will grab some of the chat ideas in there as well. So one approach to synchronous, asynchronous, we laid some of this out in a graph thinking about the best uses here in a simple table. And some of these reflect what you say. Some of these were a little bit different. So perhaps thinking about synchronous for discussing less complex issues, the interesting part of that is it was the opposite of what Sylvia said. Getting acquainted within the synchronous environment, so a way of getting contact, teacher presence hours, planning tasks, and the why, using synchronous as a way to maintain a physical presence in the class. And I would say this really depends on how you're using synchronous. Webinars and synchronous tools can also do the opposite of maintain a physical presence and make everyone feel that there's nothing there, but using it as a place for, I think a couple of you said, office hours, connecting with students, kind of adding that presence. And I do want you to think throughout this session of this idea of presence. Students may become more committed and motivated because of this immediacy, the quick response, and when immediate feedback is required. And I think Dan was touching on that a little bit, in that you can provide immediate discussions, immediate feedback, although synchronicity may be a little slow in his case for music. And how? Lots of video conferencing tools we're using in the synchronous area right now. At UBC, Collaborate Ultra is the most used tool, and it's built right into the LMS. So anybody with a Canvas course can create multiple Collaborate Ultra sessions, and their students will be added into the sessions. There's also a number of instructors at UBC using Zoom as an alternative synchronous web conferencing tool. So asynchronous, the when. So reflecting on complex issues, for example, within the discussion board, when synchronous meetings cannot be scheduled. So I know a lot of instructors now are dealing with things across time zones, for example, and it may be difficult at times to have synchronous meetings. The why, students have more time to reflect, they can control their own learning, they can learn at different different times. A lot of students right now are dealing with challenges, I'll talk about this in a little bit, around bandwidth, around space, and it can give them more independence and flexibility in managing their time. And I do want to mention really quickly this notion of presence or physical presence. It's different in the async environment, but online learning has traditionally been able to bring teacher presence into the asynchronous world with using discussion summaries, quick responses to discussion, using video, using images of the instructor to create that presence. And how? We're lucky at UBC. We have lots of different tools we can use. So this could be Canvas discussion groups, modules, assignments, quizzes. It could be working with Kaltura, sharing resources within the library course reserve system. It also could be using Piazza for discussion. So a huge wide range of tools at UBC. And I'm going to turn it over to Manuel now.
So we're going to have an additional activity based on your initial thoughts that you have on the chat right now. So basically, I'm going to share with you the link to that particular activity. We're going to be using Padlet. So the link is on the chat. So let me know if you're unable to access that particular site, and I'll explain a little bit what we're going to be doing in the next 5-10 minutes. So Padlet, for those of you who do not know what it is, it's a way to kind of recreate some activity that you have on screen right now. So basically having participants putting post-it notes on a wall and a way to kind of basically create a resource, having them think about different strategies in a very simple way and just putting them on a space there. So let me know, thumbs up, if you're able to access the Padlet, and I'll get started with the instructions. Right. So it's an open source platform. Anybody can use this. There is no account required to participate. So this is definitely something you could also use in your own teaching if you think this could also be a valuable technology for you. It's not supported at UBC, but it does offer ways of collaborating for students as well. All right, so I'm going to get started with the instructions then. So in this activity, we'd like you to think again about your course and identify the things that can be done using both the synchronous part of things and asynchronous. So in the original activity, we kind of ask you, what are the things that make sense in your course? If this is moving more towards synchronous, which is the case of Danny, for example, but what are the things that could be done in the asynchronous or vice versa? And then think about the bridging aspect. So in this particular graph, you have like 3 different domains, and what really is important right now is just to find ways to combine both. Like, how could we combine synchronous with asynchronous, and think about activities. So I've already put some activity there just to get you started with this and just understand a little bit, what you're supposed to do. So I'm going to share the Padlet right there on the screen. So I'm going to be switching to something else. So now you should see my screen, and I can see some of you already contributing. So I'll be refreshing the page so then you can see how it is developing in real time, actually. So it's an interesting platform. You don't need to use this, let's say, in real time, but it can work in both, in fact, modalities, asynchronous and synchronous. It really becomes a collaborative space. And in the background, you have an image that basically is a description of the kind of a description of what the activity may look like. So thinking about what are the things that you could do face-to-face, online, and the bridging aspects. So the bridge is no longer really easy to to locate on that page, but something that we could certainly share with you, after the sessions. It could be useful as a reference for you. So you can embed also videos or images if you'd like to, so it doesn't have to be necessarily text. It's an interesting platform, really. You can be quite creative with this. Right. So yes, thank you. I forgot to mention that. Like, if it's easier for you to locate what you've done, we highly recommend you adding the course code and your name. This is something that we only use for this session today. So if you worry about privacy of information, I would say that's okay, because we're going to make sure that no one else can contribute and access this except you. And it's better for you to locate.
Manuel, there's a question in the comments about bridging.
Right. Let me just check that question.
It's bridging.
Yes. So the bridging is basically the bridging is the reflection that you have to make about what are the things that you've identified as working well synchronously, and what are the things that you've identified working well asynchronously. And the bridging would be, what are the things that you could take from both and just combine together. So let's say, Lucas has mentioned that already, but if you have a case study and you expect students to go through some documentation to kind of get acquainted with the particular case, you could have that work happening asynchronously. So all this prep work could be done online before, I would say, the synchronous session. And then in the synchronous session, you expect students to have done that initial work So then you don't need to spend an extra 10 or 15 minutes during the class to have students, going through that material. So it's really thinking about what are the things that I could be using from the other format. So then I basically maximize the use of either the synchronous or the asynchronous. And there is never the right or wrong answer. It's just based on the things that you feel, would make sense for your particular course and would make sense for your context. Of course, if you have really a large class and you tend to have a lot of activities in class, and you think that might be difficult to manage all these activities, even though we do have breakout groups, so for example, then maybe think about a way to move that over to an asynchronous format using maybe discussions instead of maybe group work or peer assessment tools. So you do have a variety of options, but the bridging is really trying to think about ways to reduce the use of one over the other, basically. Yeah.
I did just want to add the one thing about Padlet to keep in mind is it doesn't have a privacy check on it, so it is not currently FIPA compliant. We're using it today in the context of a workshop, and we're not having any of you logging into it, but it would be the similar privacy to if you chose to use something like Google Docs. So in your classroom, you may think of tools that do have servers in Canada. We're kind of demonstrating this for a large scale workshop.
And notice every time you publish something, if you are the owner of this, if I place the mouse over, I can always use the pencil and then modify it. So if, let's say, you'd like to add the course code, so then you can locate better what you've entered in those 3 columns, feel free to do it. So you can always update, what you've written. So I can see a lot of controls already, so thank you. I'm going to give you an extra, let's say, 5 minutes. So keep writing into this. If you have any questions, use the chat, and I can see there's a chat message. So if you want students to be sharing work and working maybe in a similar way to Padlet, like Lucas is more an expert of this, but the wiki could also be something that you could consider. The only difference would be the synchronous piece, where Padlet is kind of refreshing things fairly quickly, so it looks like you can follow what someone else is writing almost in real time. Right. So we do not have anything similar to Padlet that is FIPA compliant. That's unfortunate, but as Lucas mentioned, as a participant, you don't need to sign up for it. You don't need to sign in or create an account. So it's still something that could work for very specific type of activities.
Manuel, I just jumped into the discussion board and gave a couple things you might consider. Mattermost is something you can license at UBC. It's a team chat tool. So that's going to have some of the functionality here. I know on a BC level, if you look through somewhere like BC Campus or the Open Ed Tech Cooperative, they have a tool called Etherpad, which allows for a similar functionality, but I think it's a bit of a gap in terms of compliant tools and tools that enable this sort of collaboration. Another option that I would probably use in a lot of cases would be the whiteboard tool in Collaborate Ultra or in Zoom using an annotated PowerPoint.
Yes. An interesting question in the chat regarding the use of whiteboard, Lucas, from Danny.
Yeah, I saw that question. Danny mentions that the whiteboard in Ultra is not that reliable. It disappears when I change screens. Absolutely, that is a I guess it's operating the way they've designed it. So as soon as you change screens, you do lose all the information. What I do is I use Alt Print Screen, and I do a quick screen print of what people are sharing on the whiteboards. And absolutely, Sylvia, on Collaborate or with Zoom, students do have an anonymity on the whiteboard. So they could say things that you don't want them to, and that can be a challenge as well. Naomi mentions it's borderline unusable. I have used a Collaborate Ultra whiteboard with pretty large groups of up to 60. I did find it was relatively usable, not perfect. It's not Google Docs, it's not Padlet. I was able to kind of use it with print screen. But again, it's not going to be a perfect tool.
And again, remember, a lot of you mentioned student engagement. So these are always strategies to get you engaged and get the participants engaged. But it all depends, what are the things you'd like to do once you finish the activity, if it's supposed to become a resource or just a space, a place for sharing for the time being. So you always have to consider those things, and if the technology is really the best one. So the whiteboard is just, I would say, a one-off type of technology. You cannot save it unless you do a screen, a print screen. So thank you so much for sharing, your ideas. I'm looking right now what Jennifer entered for her course in particular. So I can see interesting things happening. So discussions in a synchronous manner, discussions of more difficult content, have students rate the difficulty of certain aspects of the theory and problem. And asynchronous would be reading, pre-reading quiz, post-lecture, 1-minute paper. So these are really, really good strategies to use both modalities. And then the interesting things would be the bridging. So asynchronous students look at a drawing using something like a Padlet or whiteboard for students group to label a similar drawing. Back in lecture, we discussed the parts that are hardest to understand conceptually. So you can actually see this sort of connection happening already. And again, when you start doing the bridging, it's always really important later on is just to really make sure that the connection and is really clear for students, so they get a sense of, okay, I really need to do these things asynchronously ahead of time or a certain time to get ready for the synchronous. So making sure they understand the logic and the design of the course. So thank you so much, and you can keep adding ideas to this if you'd like to have access to this after this session. I'm to keep this Padlet live, and so then you can still retrieve some of this information, but really interesting thoughts right now. I can see a lot of things happening in the chat as well. So I'm going to go back to our slides. So let's get back. So now that you've been starting thinking about what are the things that make sense, synchronously, asynchronously, what are the things that could be combined in this graphic? And sorry, it's kind of I needed a lot of space to include all this information. Is just to think about where do you stand on this line between a fully synchronous format on the left-hand side and a fully asynchronous format. And as you kind of start doing this sort of reflection on what makes sense in my course, it's actually interesting to see if you're just more located on the synchronous side or asynchronous side. So I'll give you a minute to look into this, and unfortunately I have the time reduced instruction, so the instruction is kind of hidden. I have to revise that page a bit. So basically, based on how you stand on that particular spectrum, is just to think about how could you describe this particular format. So in this case, some of you may be familiar with this concept. I'm happy to indicate what it is, the flipped classroom. So the flipped classroom, in that case, I've renamed it the flipped online learning. So it's basically a way for you to let students do some work on their own in the asynchronous format. So having, let's say, just like Jennifer was saying, having some case study material, students could do those readings on their own time online, and then once you do the synchronous session, then you keep the same amount of time. If you have a synchronous session for 2 or 3 hours, this stays the same. But the thing is, you no longer need students to do the reading during that time. You can actually focus more on active learning. So the flipped online learning is really a nice strategy to kind of benefit a lot from the synchronous session to do more active learning, provide feedback, just having students work in groups and share strategies together. So really making it a little bit more engaging in a way. And using the asynchronous to kind of have a lot of self-paced learning. But then you always have modulations in those sort of format where you may be using the asynchronous quite a lot or quite not. So it always depends on your context and your intention. So I'm putting the flipped classroom close to the synchronous format, the flipped online learning, and I have a short description. Then we move to a more like a mixed format. Say you're going to be using a little bit more of the asynchronous. So you might be using the asynchronous for very specific type of activities. You might have some graded quizzes or some assignments or peer assessments. So you move towards a little bit more to the asynchronous piece of things. And in the mixed format, I'm giving you ways of designing this. It's absolutely basic and it does not reflect what you may end up developing at all. Okay. So in the mixed format, the way I see it, you could have some alternates of synchronous and asynchronous teaching. Basically, you could just say, I want to be teaching my first week fully synchronously because I think my presence is really important. I need to set the tone of the course, just make sure that students understand what the course is about. So you could just say the first week is going to be synchronous, but then you've built this sort of report and students get to know you and get to know expectations a little bit better. You could just say my week 2 is going to be fully asynchronous because now it's time for them to maybe work more in groups in Canvas or do a little bit of work on their own, and then maybe on the 3rd or 4th week we actually meet again in a synchronous session. So you could have this sort of scenario where you kind of do one and then the other and one and then the other, and that's part of the blend already. Or in some contexts you have you may just decide to have 3 weeks fully synchronous and then 3 other weeks fully asynchronous. Again, it really depends on your course and the kind of things that you expect students to be able to learn on their own, and then that do not necessarily require you to be there in a synchronous manner. And again, we've got some contexts where some courses have a lot of international students, like let's say in China or in Europe, and then they are not able to join you in a synchronous manner. So you may have to kind of shift things a little bit more to the asynchronous format because basically you don't have any other choice. So there is always your side of things, your presence, what makes sense to you, but also consider the social presence, also what makes sense for the students. Always very important. So I'm offering this mixed format type of things, but the mixed format could just be displayed in so many different ways. Then there is time reduced instruction. So time reduced is a concept that we used during the flexible learning initiative 6 or 7 years ago, where you kind of again move towards asynchronous way more than in the synchronous, and basically you no longer require students to spend 2 or 3 hours in a synchronous manner because you just realize you can do so much in the asynchronous space. So you start saying, instead of meeting for 2 hours or 3 hours in a synchronous, you kind of say we're only going to be meeting 1 hour, but then you have to make up that time in the asynchronous format. So we've seen these sort of formats happening, and we may have some of you today just considering using the Canvas space more than the synchronous space, or Collaborator chat, for example. So it's really trying to balance things. And again, you don't have to make a plan today, but we're just giving you ways of thinking about this a little bit already. And I can see a lot of messages happening in the chat. Am I supposed to answer those questions, Lucas, or?
Well, I've been answering a lot of the questions within the chat, so I wouldn't worry about that for now.
Right. Okay.
I've been chatting with some folks.
Right. 2 things, because I'm looking at one comment. There is a lot of interesting things happening right now, because all the things that you might be developing, let's say if you do some synchronous session, just like we do right now, we do record the session. So ultimately, if students are unable to join that particular session, it becomes a resource, and you can make it available for the students for them to watch it later. So, and that's something you could also do moving forward, in a year from now, in 2 years from now, just reusing some of the things you've done today, because that could also be extremely useful. So that's one thing. The other thing is, once you do the balancing between synchronous, asynchronous, in the definition of blended learning, we use the term of thoughtful integration. And the thoughtful is really, really important, because it means having thoughtful course design and trying to think about, if I do a lot of asynchronous, does it make sense for my students, and how much time does it take? And we end up sometime, when we do the blended learning, we end up with a course and a half, because we have instructors just realizing how much the asynchronous and how much, let's say, Canvas can do, but they kind of put a lot of files and create all these sort of activities with a proper link between the synchronous and asynchronous, and sometimes not a proper link, so students don't really see the value of doing those activities. But then also the fact that you may end up with maybe too much on Canvas. So I really try to stress that thing about the design aspect of that particular experience. So try to really think about how much time does it take for students to complete all these activities, and is that still does it still make sense to ask them to be there 2 or 3 hours in a synchronous session? So really important to think about the balancing between the two. And I can see a lot of things being shared on the chat, so thank you so much. And I will leave it to Lucas.
Wonderful. So one thing we wanted to talk about really quickly here is the idea of anxiety, and it's an anxious time for everybody. I think there's anxiety driven in all modalities, but there can be a particular type of anxiety that's created with too much reliance on synchronous methods. And this anxiety can be for yourself and also for your students. Students right now, again, are dealing with things like time zones, dealing with family commitments, dealing with taking care of their children, dealing with stress, not having enough time. So I'm sure you're dealing with some of the same stuff. So having to be at a particular synchronous session at a certain time can be a challenge. Cases I've seen of this are where there's a synchronous tool like Zoom or Collaborate being used for, say, a 3-hour lecture. So students in that 3-hour lecture have to be there. They have to deal with their bandwidth challenges. I don't know if any of you are having bandwidth challenges. My sister lives in rural Canada, and she has a bandwidth cap right now. So she has only a certain amount of bandwidth she can use each month. I'm talking to students who aren't able to connect to Wi-Fi, who are taking part of their classes on a phone, who are using their neighbor's Wi-Fi. So I think one thing when we think about this synchronous versus asynchronous decision is, how much bandwidth stress are we placing on students? And that could be thinking of bandwidth being a technical piece, like using up their monthly bandwidth. They're trying to come into sessions on a slow computer. It can also mean thinking about bandwidth in terms of their mental space, is how are they able to deal with all of the challenges, how to deal with all of the challenges that they're dealing with while at the same time attending live sessions. Absolutely. And some people are noting that in the chat right now, it can be really challenging just to follow the chat at the same time to follow the speakers as well. Simon asks about how much bandwidth does a 1-hour Collaborate session use. I don't have the information on that, and it would really vary on how you use Collaborate or how you use Zoom. For example, right now we're sharing slides with you in Collaborate that we've uploaded. If we chose to share screens with you, it would use a lot more bandwidth, and a lot more of you may have trouble accessing the screens. They would take longer loading. If you use cameras, it takes more bandwidth. But from my understanding, particularly Zoom can be quite heavy on bandwidth depending on how it's set up. So I think the lesson there for me when I'm thinking about teaching is, and I think a lot of you have kind of touched on this already, what is the value of synchronous? So what are those times where synchronous is high value? Modeling, as Dan talks about, team activities, as Anka talks about, a social present, explaining difficult concepts, as Sylvia talks about. So where can we really be effective and use synchronous to the most value for our learners? Go ahead, Manuel.
Oh, the previous slide about the anxiety, we have an interesting article that described the anxiety for both the instructor and the student. So that's definitely something we'll be sharing with you. Key considerations, just because we've been talking about so many things, and Lucas has been summarizing already some of them, is really trying to again think back about what are the key things to remember if I use the asynchronous versus the synchronous. So we talk about maintaining the teacher and social presence, really important. So for some of you, your presence, also the chance for students to interact is really important. That's again something that will drive the way you anticipate designing your course, whether if it's more asynchronous and synchronous. But regarding both modalities, you can have a strong collaboration between learners. It doesn't have to be in real time. That's what we try to say here. So in asynchronous self-regulated learning, so if you put things on Canvas and let students do a lot of things on their own, you give them a chance to have more control over the pace of their learning. If there is a video in there, they can play the video back and forth and again, use discussions to ask questions. So you give them a little bit of time to kind of absorb the content, getting to know it. So it's that's a way for them to reduce the sense of anxiety because they have time for learning. So they work on their own pace. There is control on the learning, the timing. There is also a big chance for for you and also for students to kind of give each other's feedback using discussions, for example. We have also peer assessment systems where you give them a chance to again provide feedback on their particular assignments. You could do this from an individual side of things, group side of things, a lot of options, and basically also all these things combined, allow you to build a sense of community. Whether if it's, even though it's not in real, you can have a lot of things happening on Canvas that are as efficient as if they were conducted in a synchronous manner, really. So and the same thing in the synchronous space, you try to keep that social presence, like having your video, and then students can see you and ask questions in real time. So get the sense that you are there for them. So that's a really important thing to keep in mind. The pace, everything always goes slower in real time, and that's something that was also addressed. Like as I'm speaking, you're asking questions on the chat, so I may have to kind of look into the chat and see what's going on. If I'm lucky enough, I may have a TA who might be able to filter the chat and help me out with this, so then I can still talking and everything. But it's slower, like Lucas did, early on in this session, asking a couple of you to engage, and then you have to give students a couple of seconds to activate the microphone, ask the question, and then deactivate the microphone, and so on. So it is always slowing everything down. If you do breakout activities, and if you have polling questions to kind of replicate something that you would do in the class with clickers, same thing. It always takes time to create that question, activate it, let people vote and stuff like that, and then come back. So everything gets slower in real time. But that being said, you have a variety of ways of engaging your students. So you have the chat, you have the breakout groups, whole questions again, and also the raise hand. As simple as this. If you want to, if you lecture and if you want to make sure students get it, but you don't necessarily want to have hundreds of questions on the chat, you could just say raise your hand. So then, you get some who can just make sure that you pay attention to what's going on and making sure, if there is a question asked, then, raise your hand. You can also monitor student questions using the chat, for example, and also assess student readiness. So a poll question would be a nice way of doing this. You would just write right there, we just say, okay, let's see if we are on the same page there. You just have your poll question and have a chance for students to respond and provide feedback and make sure that they are where they are supposed to be. So a lot of different strategies. Again, we could end up with a list of 100 strategies on these sites, but we try to make this a bit easier for you to get started with these things. So I think we are getting closer to the end of the session. So if you have any questions, you can use the chat, or if some of you are interested, we can also activate your microphone and answer our questions. So if I may, I can answer some of the questions in the chat. So Anka, you're interested in the slides? Yes, for sure. We also use a wiki page for that particular workshop. So on that wiki, we'll be providing the slides as well as the session recording. If some of you want to have access to the Padlet activity, I'm happy also to put that link there. Yes, so Scott, yes, the strategy of having TAs to moderate and facilitate the chat is a common strategy we highly suggest. In particular, if you end up having a lot of activities that you expect to do in a synchronous space, and you might be new to this, it's always reassuring to have someone having your back and just making sure that the course goes smoothly. So I'm actually very fortunate to have Lucas with me today, because I know he has a lot of experience with Collaborate, but it does reduce my sense of anxiety dealing with something that is running synchronously, for sure.
There was a question that kept coming up in the chat around how do I create learning community in my course, both for synchronously and asynchronously. And what I wondered is if does anyone in the room have any suggestions for that? Like, all of you have been teaching this term. What approaches have you taken to creating more community between learners? Sometimes this is called social presence within your classroom. Maybe I could get someone to put their hand up and you can jump on the mic and explain this. Great. Anka, do you want to jump on the mic there?
Sure, yeah. One thing that I've tried is putting students in teams. So they stick with the same teams for the course. And then you hold like a session where, so the teams are only like 4 students, where they have to meet and sort of do kind of introductions as a team. So they meet at a separate time outside of class. And then you can meet with them for the first few minutes. So they then have at least those 4 people that they get to know a bit.
Great, thank you. And we have a question from Jen about what do you suggest for students that are in different time zones, but the class still requires a minimal amount of synchronous activity. One approach to that we learned when we were working with the large open courses a few years ago was if you can have students add some questions to the discussion board in asynchronous time, and you can address those questions in a synchronous way. So that can help you deal with the time zones a little bit, because at least they're able to feed into the synchronous question. Another one was always to try to negotiate times where it would kind of hit that sweet spot between time zones. So a lot of classes were at 8:30 having a quick synchronous check-in to deal with that. Otherwise, of course, recording your synchronous sessions so that those students are able to benefit for that, or having particular open synchronous office hours to accommodate those students at different time zones. Again, maybe using a threshold time, something that might be a little bit early for you, but and maybe a little bit late for them, but both of you can be there.
It's actually interesting, if I may, the strategy that Lucas was sharing. We've been working with on MOOCs, those massive open online courses where you have students all over the place in the world and in different time zones, and it's always really difficult to deal with those different time zones. And again, having a chance to say, ask your question in discussion, give them a couple of days, and then say, I have the synchronous session scheduled at that time. I'm going to be addressing those questions. You give them a voice to kind of say, these are the things that are concerning to me. And then if then they don't have a chance to talk to you in a synchronous manner, if you save that synchronous session as a video, then they can always watch it later and just have a chance to listen to your answers as well. So it's always strategies that we kind of recommend doing.
Great. So I think we're heading towards the end of the session. Thank you very much. It was great to see all of you virtually in the session. We have taken a lot of the key points from the chat and will anonymize this as well as sharing the recording. And we look forward to learning from you about different approaches that you're taking. Finally, you can register for other sessions. Suki's put the note in the registration. And one thing I wanted to mention is we are offering a larger experiential course on blended learning that's going to be started on May 11th. And that's going to focus on asynchronous and synchronous best practices and actually have you build some a module or a week and adapt your syllabus. So you can find that course on CTLT events. Manuel, any last things to add?
No, just the same. This course is happening soon, but if there is an interest, we'll be happy to offer it again. So then we can help you come up with a plan for the summer or even fall term.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.